It is an honor and a pleasure having you back home for this speech at the 16th Lisbon SIPE meeting. And I must add that it's not only an honor for SIPE to receive you at this ceremony, but also a great pleasure to receive a former member who has now become President of the Republic. I remember it well as one of the founders of our SIPE in Crete 2004, when some time ago in 2011, in 22nd September 2011, in the first meeting organized in Lisbon, you were the moderator of the morning session of our 8th Congress under the general theme, the protection of fundamental rights in Europe, before and after the accession of the European Union to the European Convention of Human Rights. It was at the time an important issue. Nowadays is not, but still is in some aspects, but not the same way as it was discussed at the time. Now, when SIPE comes back to Lisbon again, your presence is indeed indispensable. Thank you very much for being here, Professor Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa. You are very welcomed at your law faculty, as well as to your SIPE, the Association of Public Law Professors, which you are and will always be a member. So without further delay, it's yours, the floor. We will be delighted to hear you for whatever you want to tell us in this Congress.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Vasco Pereira da Silva, Chairman of this Congress. And dear colleagues, starting with the new future doctor honoris causa of our school. We just have to wait until October, the 24th of October, how do you call it, to have you here receiving that prestigious degree. Well, dear colleagues, here we are. Some of us, we know each other for very long. Others, it's a surprise, and a very good surprise to see you here in Portugal. You are at home, and with Professor Vasco Pereira da Silva, you are at home in a very intense way, because he's really very warm, very brilliant, very clever, very warm, and with all the qualities of the Portuguese without the defects we have. Just qualities. So, well, when I saw the subject of your Congress, I said to myself, how important it is, this subject? And I started recalling the times I spent here. I came in 66, 50 years ago, to this school as a student and then professor. At that time, when we spoke of law, national law, international law, we were living in the period of the 60s and even the 70s in a way, in which we believed living in democracies. And Portugal was fighting for democracy in the 60s, but getting democracy later on. We believed that democracy would win all over the world, would overcome any kind of obstacles. The rule of law would be a universal reality. International law would be respected. International organizations would be reformed, reshuffled. Little by little dictatorships, either authoritarian or totalitarian, would disappear. That law had several dimensions. The first one is the ethical one, or the philosophical one, or theological one. Then the structural one, I mean, the conditions, economic, social, cultural conditions that would influence law in its birth, in its longer or shorter life. Political, the political power that would reinforce law, or at least decide, and then the one that we used to study in our schools. I mean, the rules themselves, with the exception of the Anglo-Saxonic that would prefer the cases, not the rules that would be, in a way, the general systematic view of the law, but law in action, law in concrete cases. That was our thought. And at the same time, we believed that human rights would prevail, a humanistic vision of law would prevail. The debate was whether personal rights, political rights would be more important than social, economic, or cultural rights. Of course, at that time, mostly in Portugal, there was a very strong Marxist influence. So the different Marxisms would prefer economic, social, and cultural rights to personal or political rights. But in a way, the majority of us believed that at the end of the way, there will be an end of history. Fukuyama spoke of it. A perfect economic society, balancing welfare state with human rights, with freedom, with liberty, with pluralism. And this would be universal. We knew, of course, that we were living in a world that was a bipolar world with two superpowers, and that European communities were trying to achieve the European Union that came later on. It was still a long way to go, 20 years by then. And so, in a sense, law was a sign of stability. There was tension, but tension is the normal situation in any society. I used to say to my students, political science students, reality shows that tension is the general rule and that peace is the exception. But law was the way of finding that exception in the middle of a general rule of conflict. That's why we needed a law to solve the conflicts. But they were solvable. Well, much before the end of the century, we started understanding that the world had changed a lot. Bipolar world disappeared. It became, for a while, a world with a single superpower, United States of America. The implosion of the Soviet Union and the crisis in the different Marxisms showed, in a sense, that we could finally achieve that universal, global, international law. And it would look like very much the European and then the American kind of law. And these would, in several years, be the reality also in Africa and Latin America and in Asia. Probably Asia Pacific a little bit more difficult because of the tradition of another way of seeing law. Sometimes for religious reasons, altogether with religious power and political power. You would not separate, as we used to do in our democratic states with rule of law. Well, this monopole the world lost for very, very short time. It was replaced by an attempt of multilateralism correspond to multipolarism. New powers emerging, replacing the old powers or completing the old powers. A new opportunity for old international organizations that seems very, very much outdated. United Nations, what is now the African Union, some of the Latin American organizations or Asian organizations. In the case of European Union, it was different because it evolved from the European communities to European Union. And so apparently following a path that would be a path with enlargement, deepening and enlargement at the same time would be very promising. But we knew by then that it was not obvious that international law would ever be peaceful in its respect. Because all over the world, we had news of violations of international law. Then we understood that organizations unable to reform themselves. Unable. Even when they were fixed the way it was at the end of the Second World War. Unable. Ignoring the reality of new continents, of new powers, of new realities, both economic, social, and cultural. And rule of law prevailed, developed, but the attempts against it, the obstacles concerning its implementation were growing. And then we discovered, we didn't discover, it was obvious. No, crisis was the general rule, not just conflict, but crisis was the general rule. And that we had crisis more and more frequently. Economic crisis, social crisis, sanitary healthcare crisis, cultural crisis, and political crisis. And they were, if not all of them global, they tended to be global. And there were no institutions to deal with this reality. It was no longer the question of European Union, of a continent, of a region. No, it was much more than that. Well, by then, we also discovered that time is a key reality for politics, society, and law. Law was always outdated, always far behind the changes, the acceleration in science, technology, and finance, and economy, and politics. And this was becoming a real problem. Because it was not only the fact that the institutions were outdated, the new challenges were more and appeared so quickly, unexpectedly that it was hard to solve them in due time, or at least to address them in due time. But one would like to believe we had still time to adjust. Of course, they were pioneers. Professor Vasco Pereira da Silva was a pioneer in a sustainable development vision. This idea of sustainable development that appeared in the 70s and in the 80s was far away from the worries of most of the powers and the legal systems almost till the end of the century. They knew it, they admitted it, but it was not really the priority it is today. We were, again, far behind the events. And then, of course, recently, we lived several crises, mostly in Europe, and I see that the majority of you are Europeans, that are global. These realities were global and they are global, but asked new interventions in public policies, public and private law. In a way, a division that is also outdated for very long. For very long. We keep it for pedagogical reasons, but we know that public law has always some private dimension, and that private law has necessarily a strong public dimension. Well, the first challenge was the financial crisis, and I'm just speaking of those crises of this new century that started in the United States, that came to Europe later on. It was a banking crisis apparently in the beginning. It became a financial and budgetary crisis afterwards, an economic crisis. And it went on from 2008, let us admit, until in some cases 2015, 14, 15. In other cases, it was not so long. And we discovered that the economic reality had changed because science and technology had asked for financing. And the so-called second, third industrial revolution had been replaced by different financial revolutions. And the new financial powers control the old economic powers. So you could have a crisis coming from the financial sectors, both private and public, and not from the classic economy. That was new. In so many cases, there were no tools of intervention, either because one had been in what we call in Europe a too liberalist way, the Thatcherism, much before the Trumpism, the Thatcherism, the 80s, a little bit of the 90s. So no institutions allowing intervention on markets, not just the managing of the budget, the state budget, but the management of the large financial system. And still today, we don't have it. in what concerns insurance. We speak a lot of the banks. We don't speak of the insurance companies, the insurance sector. Or the other new means of financing the economy, small agencies, private companies, small private companies, flexible. Many of them not being under different states. So, was it a time of tension? It was. Tension in the sense that it was a new reality. That crisis changed not only our lives, but changed a part of our institutions. Not all of them. Not all of them. We did all lessons. At the time to do it. We started doing it. We didn't finish. We didn't finish. So, all of a sudden appeared the pandemic. And when the pandemic appeared, we may say there were other pandemics before, but none of them so global as this one. So unpredictable and so global. And it was quite frightening to see the ignorance of the institutions and the absence of law, of rules to deal with. Incredible. My grandchildren lived in China by then. Not all of them, but 4 of them. It's a very wealthy region of the south of China, built to, in a way, to destroy Hong Kong, what it did, with a GDP higher than the one of Hong Kong. And they lived for a while in the beginning, the pandemic. That came from China. Nobody knew what was happening, and they were in their schools, having their temperature controlled, feeling cautious measures that were being taken even before China admitted there was a pandemic. And the world didn't know it. And we still believe that the World Health Organization didn't know it all. It did know, but decided not to know. And let us forget what happened. Let us recall that it was promised the birth and the strength of a new European agency for health care. Till now, it's much more a project than a reality. The reform of the World Health Organization didn't happen. For the same reasons why we don't have the reform of the United Nations. The strong powers don't want it. They don't want it. That's just the reason. So if they want to have the possibility of blocking any decision in the Security Council. So we can have a war, but it does exist because it's blocked the discussion, the debate, and the voting on it. And for the first time, the question, a new healthcare reality, asking for new institutions, for new law, and for the reflection on the law we had concerning emergency situations that in the different constitutions were not conceived for such a crisis. They were conceived for political crisis, for economic crisis, having political effects, but not for sanitary emergency situations. And it is impossible to have that debate nowadays. One is trying during the amendment of the Constitution, the revision of our Constitution, and it's been impossible. Which is so deeply what was conceived 50 years ago, that any kind of way out, law, that could create a state of exception, wow, that's dangerous, being a law to be voted. How? With a majority of 2/3, 3/4. Well, the Constitution itself adopting in certain circumstances this state of emergency, it's dangerous. Well, will it stop? It happened once for a very specific pandemic. Meanwhile, little by little, there are sectors that started criticizing measures that were taken, not just under the regime of state of emergency, but outside that regime, because the other regimes were conceived not to have the parliamentary control and the constitutional control. And one invented 3 of them of different degrees. I mean, law is still waiting and waiting and waiting. Why? Because political power is waiting, knowing how hard it is to rule on that question. It happened 2 or 3 years ago. No way of changing classic law. It's too soon. Shall we wait for another pandemic? And then the courts start taking contradictory measures and decisions on whether it's legal, whether it's constitutional or not, what has been done. Myself, each time I had to renew the state of emergency, and it was done 10 times, declared twice, renewed 10 times, it was, in a way, a little bit dramatic. Have to measure advantages, benefits and costs of what would be the result of those rules. It's a discussion that must be done. Must be done. And more than done, because in academic fora, it has been done, but not in political fora. It's too hot, too complex, too disturbing. And then we came to war. But we can say there was war everywhere. We're speaking now of the Ukrainian war, but plenty of wars, we know them, local, regional, continental, a little bit everywhere. But this one was a global war. And we didn't have a global war for a while, because having a former global power that is now regional power, Russian Federation involved, a super global power, United States involved, another, let us hope, global European Union involved. Not speak of those that are not involved, but they are involved in mediations. China, for instance. Now South Africa, emerging power. Now Brazil, emerging power. So little by little, one had this awkward situation, is that apparently it was European war, but where all the great powers of the world were involved. even when they were not directly involved. They were abstaining, sometimes voting for, other times voting against. Always intervening very actively. Well, and then we discovered that the United Nations only could intervene in those areas that were allowed by the belligerents. The Syrians, what had to do with the prisoners, change of prisoners, or humanitarian, in some cases humanitarian law, but not in the substance of other very important field. I mean, the fact of having Security Council blocked without the power of the General Assembly of in a way, replacing the Security Council with what happened in the 60s, in some cases, in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, meant that violation of international law, even crimes, and then there was a dispute whether it would be a new court or a court that already exists to try those casualties. And in a way, nobody really wanting very much, even, well, European Union was an exception. But the rest of the world trying not to turn this into a priority, which would be interesting and important for other wars, not just for this war, obviously, but for other wars. It's important to know what's the role of a global organization concerning wars all over the world. But it is worsening. We have continents where it's the case of Africa, where instability becomes the rule. And then, of course, instability connected with misery, poverty, with hunger, with economic and social crisis, with migrations. And continents like Europe look at the migrations at the end of the way, and they say, well, that's very dangerous for us. But they don't look at the migrations in the starting point of this procedure. Because nowadays it's easy to migrate in less than a month from Central Africa to Northern Africa. No longer having to wait for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. No, almost instantaneous. And then some hypocrisy appeared, obviously. And you see the situation in the Sahel. Stability, failed states, absence of international respect of international rules. We have humanitarian and peacekeeping missions. Nobody wants to be involved in them. Nobody. Starting with European countries. Nobody. We speak at ease because Portugal is many of them. But left alone, those that asked us to go in, as if they were asking us, inviting us for dinner at their homes, then they said, I must leave, please have the dinner on yourself. We'll be back as soon as possible. This happened in Mali and Central African Republic. It's coming to the south of Africa, little by little. And when you have failed states, states without the control of political power, then you have the chaos that forces migrations. And migration became one tension, not a temporary tension. Let us admit that the pandemic was a temporary tension. This one is a long-term, continuous tension. Today I had lunch with the ambassadors of the EU countries and those countries that want to become members in different stages. And I had to say, I'm so sorry, but you're unable to have a common policy concerning migrations. But the starting point would be the partnership with those countries, mostly Africans or Near East countries or Middle East countries, where from come those migrations. Those that are really in the future, next future, millions of people, not thousands of people, millions of people. We know where they're migrating. Why not preventing it? Working with, in partnership with African countries. I think it's obvious, and it is. These needs new tools, new institutions, and the new law to deal with this. Well, I'm speaking of political kind of tensions, but I know that you treated also scientific and technological different new challenges that are factors of tension. Artificial intelligence, for instance, that is now starting to worry the politicians because they are being attacked by the media, the new media, and they blame them of manipulation and everything else. That causes problems in the functioning of societies and economies. Changing the world of employment, changing the structures of economy and of society. So I used to say to my dear fellow heads of state and heads of government that the problem is not specifically the fact of the media, of the artificial intelligence and the use of it to get facts, to collect facts, to simplify, to replace, much deeper than it. It's their societies and their economies. These needs institutions, universal institutions, that accept the adoption, first of all, the debate, and then the adoption of universal rules. At the moment where multilateralism is in crisis, during a war, nobody is multilateralist. Nobody. And even those that feign to be, they are not. There are some exceptions that keep on dialoguing with everyone. But you are blamed of being, well, something strange, keeping in touch with someone that is in touch with the enemy. And as we're living this together with inorganic new movements, and what is called, not a very good expression, but it's populism, meaning that the classic systems are in crisis and new realities replaced those that are no longer able of trying to solve the problems of society and economy. In such a moment, without multilateralism, there is no international law. We live in a period where it's a fight. Every day is fight for international law and for international organizations. even those that are outdated, better than not have them. Because in this kind of period, people are very selfish. People, persons, people, states, people, regions, people, selfish, fighting for survival. And so, forgetting dialogue, tolerance, and we need them to build a new law, or even to reinforce the law you have. So that's why I feel that your Congress was courageous, because didn't wait too much to address the challenges. And I just spoke of several, of many other challenges. Because, for instance, education. One of the worst sectors, the most affected by the pandemic, was education. I have the theory that it destroyed 2 years, about 3 in some cases, 3 years in our schools. But worse than that, it destroyed the ties between among professors, among students, between professors and students. They disappeared. Nowadays, we have in Portugal a certain labor fight between the professors and the government concerning the years during which they had most of their rights suspended for financial reasons. And speaking with the professors, many of them tell me, now we do not meet very often. We go to our schools when we have classes, when we are not on strike, but we don't have, it's not a problem with time. We don't feel like meeting with our colleagues. We lost it. Of course, the digital is very good. Yes, it is, but we felt the soul of the school. And by majority of reason, what is felt by the students. Students go to the exams, go to some classes, the least they can. Now it's desperate to ask a student, even in law, not necessarily in this school, but who is your professor on that stuff? Well, my professor. Who is my professor? You know, I just went to a couple of lessons. I was there for, you know. Even in schools that really are doing well, not the rest of it. And I ask to my colleagues that are not professors in social science, they consider themselves really scientists, so they are the science, the same. The same. Education, like culture that stopped and didn't recover, is recovering little by little. But education suffered a lot. And I don't speak of those older that got depressed and with strange fears of their safety, their security, their health situation. But students that lost the feeling of belonging to a school. So it is a tension. It's a different kind of tension. Psychological tension, sociological tension. How to address it? And what can law do to try to solve? Well, public law can help trying to adjust institutions where we are very good. better than private law professor or private law researchers, to try to adjust to a new reality with flexible formulas, because things change so fast that what we create for today must be able to solving problems of tomorrow. But then substantial law, what can be done? Not organic law, not procedural law, not even substantial but conjunctural law to recover what has been lost, to amend what has been in a sense destroyed. What shall we learn for the future in school? In research centers, it was easier because they resisted much better. They were protected. A school is never protected there. It's always open to the society. So, in a way, anyway, I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist because my point was always that this was the general rule. That's why we needed law and we needed institutions, because conflict, tension, crisis was the general rule. But most of my friends didn't believe it. They believed, no, that stability, peace, and long-term formula would work forever. Now they understood it's not true. They understood. And now having understood, so we must in a way recover the time we've lost with so many tensions, so many crises altogether, trying to find what is feasible. Oh, I see the book of Francisco Balaguer, The Constitution of the Algorithm. What can we do about it? We cannot stop science or technology. We cannot stop the acceleration of the knowledge. So let us find a way of dealing with it. The same with the pandemic. The same with law at war. Because there is law, even in the period of war. Someone must implement it. And we need international organizations to do it. And the good news is this: traveling all over the world, I still think that we Europeans have a huge advantage. Even if there are Americans, Canadians, but mostly Americans, they're open-minded and with whom it's easy to work. Not all of them. In this time, United States is different from it used to be. But those that are open-minded, let us say one hemisphere in the United States, together with Europe, we have the values, we have the experience, we have the feeling, we have the knowledge of the world. So it's up to us to be pioneers. It won't be easy to be so many African societies that are fighting for their survival without minimal conditions to do what we can. After all, we can do. And in so many Asian societies, it's the same. Even big societies, it's the same. well, we have India, of course. India has a knowledge that in some sectors is really very, very strong. But then there is a huge majority. Social cohesion is, with all its problems, a reality in Europe. It isn't in other continents. So it's up to us to face those challenges, to work on them, to involve younger people. They are the future. They are the future. And understand one thing, and I'll finish with this very simple argument that apparently is impossible to understand in a present being 74 years old. That is, change is always the result of youth. Always. Always. New regime are those that are created by teenagers or people in their 20s or 30s. And we got used to say when someone at the age of 40 or 50 appears, he or she are too young. That doesn't exist. Experience is very important, but we cannot lose the younger generations. It's up to them to have a vital role facing these challenges. And as I do believe in those generations, I learned it by being professor. And they are better and better, even if sometimes it's not better and better. They are better and better because even from a not so good education, they get more information and more and better conditions in Europe, mostly in Europe, of learning and of acting in the future. It's up to us, bet on them, and that's why I'm so happy for being, because if there is someone that is an example of this, is Professor Vasco da Silva. Imagine, I knew him as my student at the age of 24. I think he's younger today than he was by then. Well, thank you very much, and be welcome in Portugal.
Senhor Presidente, em nome da SIPE, obrigado. Thank you so much for coming here and speaking to us so many thoughts. And so thank you for coming home both to your faculty and home to the SIPE. Thank you.